The theme of defilement is very much present in today's gospel reading, and there's two kinds of defilement that's being addressed here. One would be physical defilement, or becoming ill because we don't wash our hands, and the other that our Lord refers to is spiritual defilement. Now we notice that the Jewish leaders, and many of the Jews, as it points out, they had this custom, this precept of washing their hands before meals and things they brought home from the market. And this, of course, is a very good practice. It's a good tradition to have. It's something that most of us do even today. But part of the problem was that they made this into a religious precept, which it wasn't. And what that meant is that if anybody broke this religious precept, it would be as if they were sinning against God. And our Lord is pointing out, this is not the case. Nothing going into a man can defile the spiritual state of that man. So in other words, even if we consume some virus or something, well, that's not going to spiritually defile us. It's not going to mean we committed sin or are guilty of sin. Our Lord points out that for an individual to defile themselves, it must proceed from within themselves, from the heart of the individual. In other words, we must choose to sin. In fact, if somebody forced you to do something against your will, something sinful against your will, it would not be a sin on your part because it wasn't freely chosen. So in order to sin, we must choose that sin of our own free will. And our Lord lists a number of examples, and we can go on and on with those examples. But you know, when it comes to sin or spiritual defilement, it's true that it originates from within us, but there are things around us that can contribute to our choosing to sin. And these are, of course, temptations. And traditionally, we say that temptations come to us from the flesh, the world, and the devil. So from the flesh, meaning from ourselves, our own inclinations, our own memory, our own imagination, our own experiences of the past. When we refer to the world, the things around us, our peers, people who are an example, perhaps a bad example to us, media, television, all these things can be occasions of temptation. And finally, the evil spirits, they can tempt us. Occasionally, they might tempt a person to things that they're not even inclined to, but that's easy to reject such a temptation because we have no inclination to it. So the evil spirits will usually tempt us to those very things that we're inclined to, the things that we've experienced in the past, the things that we have some attachment to. And what they will do is they will intensify our desire for those things. Sometimes they'll even intensify the delight we take in those things so that we become more addicted to those things, so that we turn back to those things again and again and again. So we cannot blame sin on evil spirits. We cannot blame our own sinfulness on others, because as our Lord points out, we must choose to sin. Sure, we can be tempted, we can be enticed, but we are the ones who make the decision to sin. As I mentioned, one of the things that the Jewish leaders got wrong is they made the human tradition of washing hands, a good practice, into a religious precept. The other thing they got wrong, which our Lord points out, is that they put this human tradition or these human precepts above the actual precepts, the actual commandments of God. And so they accuse our Lord and his disciples of breaking, these precepts of not washing their hands. Meanwhile, they themselves are disobeying God's commandments. And our Lord is trying to draw their attention to this. It's kind of like they have things backwards. So yes, of course it's good to wash our hands. We don't want to contract germs or consume some virus by not washing things. But it's more important to protect ourselves from spiritual viruses. In other words, temptation, or those things that could lead us into sin. But they had it backwards. They had it the wrong way around. And the unfortunate thing is that most of us also tend to have it backwards. We've got it the wrong way around. I mean, think back just a few years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure we all saw images on TV or on social media of people just dropping dead from this new coronavirus. And yes, initially it was very dangerous. The virus was very potent, we could say. But very quickly afterwards, the virus mutated and became less serious. But I remember at the beginning, everybody was so paranoid. We were washing our hands so much. We didn't have a whole lot of sanitizers at that time. We were even washing things that we brought home from the grocery store. And I know some people were even washing the bottom of their shoes when they came home because they were so afraid of contracting this virus. Now, granted, there was reason to be afraid. So in many ways, it was good that we were taking these practices. But it just goes to show how concerned we are about our physical well-being and our physical survival. In other words, we don't want to physically die. Understandable. But are we equally concerned about our spiritual well-being? Are we equally concerned about our spiritual state of life or death? In other words, are we in a state of grace or in a state of mortal sin? Are we equally concerned? And most people are not. In other words, most people readily expose themselves to all kinds of temptations or occasions where they might be led into sin, and they don't think anything about it. But you wouldn't expose yourself to a deadly virus. Well, sin is deadly. You know, and there's a saying that most people, they tend to die the way they live. If we live committing mortal sin after mortal sin, you know, even though a person might be going to confession, are we really striving hard enough to overcome it? So in other words, if we live in a state of mortal sin most of the time, we might actually die in that state, and we don't want that to happen. So, you know, there are some people, for example, young people, right? They might hang around with their peers who are a bad influence upon them, and they know this. So why are you hanging around with them? Or people might watch movies that have inappropriate content, maybe nudity or something, right? Why are you watching that? You don't think it's bad for you? You don't think you might be tempted? You don't think it could incline you to sin? So we readily expose ourselves to some of these, you know, temptations that we could avoid, but we don't. And it's partially because we don't really care so much about our spiritual life, which is very, very unfortunate. You know, one of the sad things, you know, let's say somebody falls into a state of mortal sin. Well, yes, they're separated from God and they're lacking some of the graces that they need to be able to be virtuous and all this stuff. But you see, the other reality, not just that they might go to hell, but when they are in a state of mortal sin, the evil spirits have greater access to them. They can tempt them further to fall into sin again and again and again, or perhaps even greater sins. And not only that, but once they end up in hell, it's not just the separation from God, which is the primary suffering of hell, but these evil spirits will torment you for all eternity. Like, shouldn't we be afraid of that? Shouldn't we be concerned about that? Of course we should. But this is the reality. Now, you and I, we know this. But there's so many people out there, so many young people, who don't think twice about committing all kinds of sins just because their peers, their friends, are doing it. And it's very sad. It's very unfortunate. And we need to kind of meditate on this and hopefully transmit it to those around us, especially young people, to warn them of the reality of the dangers of sin.